So welcome everyone to Unlocking Issei Voices in Camp Literature. This particular panel was put together in part because as a coincidence, in the past year, there were two major projects going on involving literature in the Japanese American camps. One of them was the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation's project to start translating a Japanese language literature magazine. And then the other was everyone's favorite, Frank Abe's project, putting together a book of Japanese American literature and getting that published. So it occurred to us that it would be interesting to just sit down and talk for a bit about this literature, especially as much of it involves texts that most of the American population and English-speaking populations in general have never gotten a chance to see. So first off, my name is Steussy. I am the museum manager for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. I also happen to be the one who ended up in charge of translating the Heart Mountain Bungei, which is the Japanese language literature magazine. Also joining me today will be Frank Abe, working on his book. In addition, we are joined today by Allison, Markin, Powell, and Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda, both of whom lent their expertise in this translation project as translators in working on the oftentimes very difficult literature that we encountered in the Heart Mountain Bungei. So to start off, I would like to introduce the Bungei project in particular, because that's my baby. So just for some context, the Heart Mountain Camp, which was located in northwestern Wyoming, had a very vibrant Japanese language literature community. It turns out that quite a few editors and publishers and writers from the Los Angeles community ended up coming to the Heart Mountain Camp. I can't introduce all of them, but I would like to very briefly introduce two of my particular favorites. So on the next slide, these two gentlemen are Satoru Tsuneishi, he is the man on the left, and Nyogen Senzaki, the gentleman on the right. And for the record, I am using the English ordering of names here. Hopefully I will be able to be consistent about that, but I make no promises. Satoru Tsuneishi was an award-winning haiku author. He actually received a Kunsho or Imperial Award for promoting haiku in the United States. He's also very closely tied to the story of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. He was actually the father of a founding member of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. He himself was a pacifist who vocally supported draft resistance at Heart Mountain, and yet all of his sons served in the military, either during World War II or in Vietnam. So he's an interesting character, and it was really, really fascinating to kind of get to know him through the works that he contributed to this magazine. Nyogen Senzaki, meanwhile, was a Zen monk who did a lot to adapt Zen to American culture. And he was a regular contributor to the Heart Mountain Bungei. And it is possible, I have not been able to verify this yet, but many of the essays he contributed to the Bungei haven't made it into the known corpus of his literature. So it has been really fascinating to get to explore his work. Moving on to the next slide really quickly. Pretty much what happened at Heart Mountain was that many of these people, when they arrived, started putting together clubs. These were clubs for all sorts of traditional Japanese literature. It includes haiku, it includes tanka, it includes senryu, so the traditional forms of Japanese poetry. There were also a number of people who just wrote while they were in the camp. And then coming to around 1943, Shasei Takayanagi, Yoshiaki Iwamuro, and Tadashige Okubo started talking amongst themselves about gathering this literature together into a magazine. And so ultimately this led, if I can have the next slide, This led to the publication of the very first issue of the Heart Mountain Bungei in the January of 1944. So just for a little bit of context, Bungei. We decided that we were not going to translate that particular word, in part just as kind of in honor of and to remind people of the fact that this is Japanese language literature. It is in translation. Bungei itself is a term that means basically literature and art or literary arts. Ultimately, the Bungei ran for 6 issues. The Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation currently only has access to 5 of those, although fingers crossed, I think I have a lead on where to find the missing one. So what is in the Bungei? If I can have the next slide really quickly. Basically, the Bungei includes, first of all, a great deal of its text is given over to the work done by these various literature organizations and clubs, particularly the people who got together to write haiku, senryu, and tanka. So I suspect many people watching this are probably already familiar with haiku. It is the most widely known of these forms. This is the 5-7-5 syllable structure of short poetry, usually with a very condensed format with very strong leanings on nature imagery, and also a tendency to avoid the first person. Senryu is very much like haiku. In fact, it has the same 5-7-5 structure. But rather than avoiding the first person and keeping the focus very much on natural imagery, the characteristic of senryu is that it is commentary on daily life. It is meant to be views of normal life and experience, flashes and moments within life. Tanka, interestingly, is based on a much older form of poetry that haiku and senryu, in fact, developed out of. Tanka goes on a 5-7-5-7-7 structure generally, and it tends to have a fairly wide range of uses. So it is longer, it tends to cover more, and often one of the characteristics of tanka, although not always, is that it will have a flip in the middle of it, where part of one line, or you can read one line one way to associate it with the top, and then another way in order to continue the story with the following lines. I'm obviously overgeneralizing greatly here. The thing about tanka is that it was enjoying a revival right around the time that most of the Japanese immigrants came to the United States. So it was a very popular form at Heart Mountain. However, the Bungei was not just traditional poetry. It also included verse poetry, free-form poetry, and a great deal of prose. The prose ranges from stories that are fiction and nonfiction, and also extensive essays. For example, Satoru Tsuneishi, in fact, wrote an entire essay on the interpretation of haiku from the perspective of someone who was an editor of haiku for a magazine. So not simply introduction to haiku, but how does an expert read haiku? The other thing about the contents is that many of these have a very characteristic slice of life feel to them. These are commentaries on the experience of living at Heart Mountain. And if we can do the next slide really quickly. For us, that was the great appeal of working on this translation. Many of the people who contributed to the Bungei were Issei. There were some Kibe. There were also Nisei who wrote in the Bungei, but the majority of the people writing were the Issei. And as it happens, the Issei are the voices that often get lost in modern day conversations about these camps, in part because, unfortunately, many of the people of that generation had passed on by the time people actually began talking about this history again. And what's more, the Bungei is writings and these voices at the moment. This is what they were writing about and thinking about while they were in the camps. So in many ways, this project is giving us a chance to look into what people were thinking about and what they were experiencing at the camp as adults, as Japanese immigrants, and as people who were caught in a very difficult situation. So I'm proud to say that we have finished the initial translation of the first 2 volumes, and very soon they will be going up on the Heart Mountain website. They are not up there yet, but I can show you briefly an image of what that is going to look like. So if I can switch over to that, there we go. So this is just a simple preview of what the website is going to look like. We're going to have a main page that is basically the table of contents, but it's set up so that you can sort of skim through it, see the titles, and see just a few first lines of each of the pieces. And the goal here was to have it feel as much as possible like you were actually flipping through the magazine and deciding, oh, that looks interesting, I'm going to read that part. Once you then pick part of what you are looking at, you'll come into this section. And every piece is going to have the actual image of the original page from the Bungei, including the art that was done by Estelle Ishigo. And then on the right will be the available translation that we have in English. But if you are so inclined, you will also have the option of clicking on the tab to the right, and that will bring up the transcription of the Japanese. Because one of the things we did discover in this project is that it is very difficult to read what is written on these pages. They are mimeographed and not always of high quality. So one of the things we wanted to do was make this transcription also available in case teachers of Japanese are interested in using this as a way of exploring things and to make it just more available to as many people as possible. So that is the Heart Mountain Bungei project as seen by the person who was kind of in charge of organizing it. But next, I'm just going to give you some time to talk to, or rather hear from, Lisa and Allison, who were major contributors to the translations. They did incredible work, and I am so proud to have had them with us and so glad that they put so much effort and time into this. So, Lisa and Allison, if you'd like to talk about your side of the project.
Thanks so much, Callie. Hi, everyone. I can't see who's here in this screen, but it's really lovely to have you here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, the process of translating my part of the Bungei. I just should say, to begin with, that there were a lot of translators on this project. I think we had at least 5 or 6, maybe even more, 7 collaborators on this project. So even just organizing all of that and communicating between all the different translators about all the different parts that we were working on was a really big accomplishment. And super happy to be talking with Allison today. We had another translator, Kenji Liu, who translated the Sendyu that Callie was mentioning. He couldn't be here today, but yeah, happy to be here and talk about my portion. So what I'm going to do is just, well, Callie already talked a bit about the poetic forms, so I think you're already familiar with those, but I'll talk a little bit about what those forms meant in the context of Heart Mountain, and then I'll share a few of the poems that I translated with you. So as Callie mentioned, there were haiku, tanka, sendyu, which were quite traditional forms of poetry. The Japanese Americans were writing in those forms in the Bungei. Something that was really interesting to me as a scholar of Japanese literature who had never really looked at or was too familiar with Japanese American literature was the way that the tropes and poetic forms and rules that were, you know, thousands of years old in Japan and had this very old history were kind of transposed into this foreign landscape, Wyoming, which is so different, I guess, from Japan, the landscape of Japan, where these forms sort of originated and developed for so long. So Callie mentioned that there was a lot of nature, there's usually a lot of nature imagery in haiku and tanka. That is true. And one of the ways that that comes up in the poetry is through something called kigo, which are seasonal words. Haiku and tanka in particular are very indirect forms. She mentioned that it's rare to use the first person pronoun. So while they are very short, dense, kind of expressive pieces of writing, they also tend to express emotion in a very indirect way. So it's not as though the poet is going to say, I saw this or I felt this. Rather, they're going to convey an emotion through a particular kind of image. And the way that you interpret that image and understand the emotion behind that image depends on your, I guess, knowledge of the haiku tradition. You might, as a reader of haiku, you might be expected to see a particular image that's associated with fall in a poem, and then you're supposed to know that this is something that conveys sadness, or you're supposed to pick up on the message behind that image. It's not stated directly. So it was really interesting to see the way those seasonal words appeared in these poems, but did so in a way that incorporated actual imagery from the landscape of rural Wyoming, which, you know, are not typical things that would usually appear in haiku and tanka from Japan. So there was a lot of reference to, yeah, I guess just the chill, the cold, the winter landscape in these poems. There were specific references to plants and fauna, like just that were native to Wyoming, that were really fascinating to look up and read about. And just after reading through hundreds of these poems, I felt like I had a real sense, a visceral sense of the physical landscape that they were living in. Yeah, what else is there to say about this? So I guess I will then just read a few of the poems that I translated. Oh, one other thing I guess I should mention is that something that comes up again and again in these poems is Heart Mountain itself. Heart Mountain is a mountain in Wyoming where this camp was, and it was really interesting to see the way that the image of this mountain appeared and functioned in the poems. In traditional tanka and haiku poetry, Mount Fuji and particular mountains would be very prominent in the poetry, and Mount Fuji has an almost sort of, there's a spiritual quality to that mountain. It's often worshipped as a kind of god, and so it was interesting to see the way that Heart Mountain sort of took the place of Mount Fuji in these poems, and the way that it was also personified and revered in these poems, even at the same time that it was a symbol of these people's oppression and incarceration. Okay, so I will just read a few poems that I translated. I don't have a visual for you, I'm sorry, but the poems are very short. So I will read them briefly in Japanese and read you my translation. The first one is by a poet named Sayuki Ijo. And in Japanese it reads, Ippen no kumo yogore sezu ten takashi. A streak of cloud, spotless, the tall sky. The next one is by Ozaki Kazue. In Japanese it reads, Hato mine no ura no akane ya tori wataru. A bird sails through the reddening sky beyond Heart Mountain. This one is by Fujioka Muin, and it reads, Sune ara wa kitakaze fukumichi yuku musumera yo. North wind blowing on bare shins, girls hurry down the road. And then one more by someone named Uchida Shizuka. This one reads, Evacuation no omoide nokoru, kono nimotsu tokeba, Natsukashi, waga ie no nioi. Memories of evacuation linger in the smell of home as I unpack my suitcase. Okay, so I guess I will just let Allison sort of take over. We can chat a little bit about any aspect of what I talked about, and looking forward to hearing your part too, Allison.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I'm delighted to be here. Grateful for the invitation, and I'm just excited to talk about this project because we started working on it. I think I started talking to Callie in January of this year. So yeah, when I heard about this project, there was sort of a call for translators who would be available and interested. And I work as a full-time freelance literary translator. I translate mostly fiction, mostly books. And in the years that I've been doing this, nothing like this has ever come across my desk, really. So it felt like a once in a lifetime opportunity, really, it was the ichigo ichie. And I barely leapt at it. So I was really excited to know more about it. I too I don't think I've translated anything by Japanese Americans written in this country. So almost everything I've translated is by Japanese living in Japan, or basically everybody lives in Japan. So this was quite different and required a bit of a shift, a little bit of quite a certain amount of research. What I translated Zuihitsu, 3 of those Zuihitsu, and from the first 2 volumes, first 2 issues, I mean. And Zuihitsu, I think you saw on the show that when Callie was explaining that they're most often equated with essays in English. And I mean, they're similar to essays in that it's sort of just a free-form nonfiction, usually. Zuihitsu literally means follow the brush or follow the impulse of the brush. So they're often naturalistic. This form traces back to the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon from the Heian era in the 11th century. And it's still being practiced by such contemporary writers as Kimiko Han, and even, I would say, Rivka Galchen has done her own form of the Pillow Book. But so the one that I was going to talk about today is from the first issue. It's called Pen to Megane, and the author's name is Fujioka Saiko. This is a pen name. And I'm taking a guess. I was able to do a little bit of research in the materials that Heart Mountain has available about the roster of the people who were interned at the center. And the Zuihitsu the essay that I translated also includes the author's actual name. So we do know that her first name is Chiyo. And it's possible that she's related to the author of one of the haiku that Lisa wrote earlier. And actually, I can tell, I saw in the roster that she was 59 when she wrote this essay. So I translated it as Pen and Spectacles. It is a story about, the essay talks about how she goes on a walk. It's an early spring day, and she is sort of commenting on and describing, is very descriptive of the camp itself. So we get a lot of the geography, where Heart Mountain is in relation to the barracks, and where they can go for walks, and where the gate and the fence and the different buildings are located. And also there's a lot of information. It's only, I think, like 3 or 4 pages long, but it gives a lot of information in passing about the sort of administrative organization, how organized the camp actually was, like with where people worked, and they had a police station. There was a manager of each block, sort of like a mayor or so. The kinds of record keeping that was done at the time. So Fujioka-san, she loses a pen, a beloved pen, on this walk that she's taking. And so she talks about why it was so beloved. It was a gift and it was inscribed with her name, and that's how we know what her actual name was. And then someone finds it and brings it back to her. And then she sort of pivots and starts talking about losing a set of spectacles as well, and how she so it's a charming essay, but I was just going to read one short bit. I too wanted to read a line in Japanese. This is the line that's going to come at the end, and then I'll read the excerpt. So it's Kangai nazo taen to yutta kokochi de furikaeri furikaeri tsumasaki agari no nagai sakamichi o agatte jitaku ni kaita mono de atta. We then made our way out of the field, following the path that wasn't really a path, and continued east, finally reaching the warehouse area. As we walked along the railroad tracks toward the gate, I gazed at the rows of various warehouses and facilities, aware that this was America, and that America is rich. This was the gate we had passed through when we first arrived at the center in September of last year. Reflecting upon this with unbearably profound emotion, we turned back and ascended the long and gradual slope of the road home. So, yeah, this is one of the more sort of poignant, like I said, it's sort of naturalistic, and it's sort of telling the story about her pen and her spectacles. But this is a point where we really feel the emotion of the piece. And I also selected this excerpt to read because I don't know if you heard the part that I read in Japanese, like the jitaku and kaita, like just literally thinking about those words, home and kairu. Like, I really struggled with whether or not to translate that as home, talking about going back to the barracks. Like, yes, maybe if this was written, I think in November, and she had arrived there the previous September. So they hadn't been there all that, I don't know how long they had been there, but, they had made it their home. But this was an incarceration center. So it was really, that was one of these were the kinds of things that for me was a struggle to really put into English.
Yeah, that's really lovely. Thank you for sharing. I was just thinking about, the essay you shared, and how there's also a kind of indirectness to it as well, right? She's not talking super openly about what it was like to live in the camp. It's just this kind of random story about her losing a pen and losing spectacles. But it is like a story about loss, right? And so I think it sort of seems to invite us to read between the lines in a way, even though there are these things that are very small, like a pen and her glasses. There are things that are also very, very essential to her. And yeah, I'm just thinking about the way that loss appears in a lot of this writing in a way that's maybe not quite so obvious.
Right. And even just something like spectacles, like they would be easily replaceable if they were in Los Angeles where they live, but they don't really have a way to replace all of these things. So
yeah. What was it like for you to translate the other pieces in this collection? I mean, you picked this out as your favorite, but how did you come to pick this essay in particular? Was there something that drew you to it, or to this genre of the Zuhitsu in particular?
Well, I do like Zuhitsu. One of the contemporary authors I translate, she writes. I love her Zuhitsu. I do like the form. I like the form in English as well, or I like the essay form in English. And so that spoke to me, and it was sort of a direct way into the lives of the internees. But this one in particular, I feel like of the three that I translated, this was the most, she seems to have the most literary talent. So, yes, and I don't know if I mentioned, she also published poetry within the same issue, I think. So this one I just found really touching. And the others, they were different, but kind of fascinating in their own way and what they revealed. And I just felt like, I mean, it was, I will say, difficult. And so we were working on this project together mostly in February and March of this year, which was not comparable in any way, but our own difficult time that we were going through. And it was, it was a challenge to kind of try and get into this mode of thinking, and in order to channel these voices for me. And I mean, I would ask you sort of the same thing, and what, especially with such short pieces, how you how for you.
I also, I guess translation is the art of making choices. So I struggled definitely with different choices I could make and bringing this into English. I think haiku and tanka have their own really long tradition of English translation, and Anglophone writers bringing it into English, and there's different ways that people have done it. In Japanese, haiku is written as one unbroken line, and you wouldn't always know that from reading the English translations, because in English, when we translate haiku, people tend to break it into 3 lines. It looks more like a poem in that way, in a sort of conventional sense, I think, to an Anglophone eye. And I guess I chose not to do that because I really sort of just liked the aesthetic of having the poem as one unbroken line. In the Japanese, you're supposed to sort of intuit and know where the breaks are, where you'll be sort of counting a rhythm in your head, and you'll know where one line ends and the next begins. But it's not visually distinguished. And so I guess, I wanted to experiment with how that might look if I just left it all in one line in English. And so that's what I did. I think also translating this kind of literature in particular asks maybe some different considerations from just translating something more commercial, or something that is just going to be enjoyed by, a mass readership or something like that. I think I was very aware that these were people's relatives, people's grandfathers and grandmothers, and a lot of these descendants of these writers are still alive and maybe cannot read it in the Japanese. And so I was sort of thinking, trying to take myself out of it as much as I possibly could, I guess. Not necessarily doing a literal translation, because that's impossible, but maybe leaning more in that direction, just to sort of stay as true to the language as I could. Whereas I think with something a bit more commercial or popular, I might be less inhibited to put more of my own self into the writing. I think I was aware of just the circumstances of what it meant to translate this. And so
I would ask, I would also, you mentioned the language, like I was going to ask too about, because I know in the Zohitsu that I translated, the language, let's talk a little bit. I know we want to bring Frank on soon, but just because so these were written in 1942, 1943, 1944, basically. But like, what, do you want to say anything about the form?
I will say that I wish I had paid more attention in my bungo class in grad school. I was a PhD in modern Japanese literature, but I was required to take classical Japanese. I wish I had paid more attention in that class, because it would have really come in handy in this project. I guess for those who aren't aware, the Japanese written language has gone through a lot of drastic changes, probably more so than European languages, I would say. And so there is a classical form to the language that is has different conventions of grammar and sentence endings and suffixes and things like that. Even for modern Japanese readers, it can be quite tough to read classical language, but a lot of stuff was written in classical language up until the war and even after the war. That was challenging, and I had to do a lot of research for sure to make sure I was getting things right. this project really demanded so many different kinds of skill sets, like both linguistically, and then it required just research and knowledge about Wyoming and incarceration, World War II incarceration, and yeah, a knowledge of these literary traditions and forms that are so rich and go back literally thousands of years. And I feel like, even though it was tough to sort of negotiate among so many different translators, in a way, it's so probably impossible that any one person would have all of those sets of knowledges, or the chances of that all coinciding in one person are very slim, it seems to me. So,
Yeah.
I'm really glad that it was a collaborative project.
I am too. I felt like we needed a cacophony of voices to recreate something of all of the voices that were published in these journals. So
it looks like there's some questions coming into the chat. James Okumura, which camp blocks were the Bungei and Tessaku publication clubs headquartered? Great question. I think Callie might be able to answer that better. How did you resolve difficulties you encountered with period-specific Japanese language? Yeah, I guess we were just talking about that. And then when will the projects be published and how will we be able to obtain copies for ourselves? Yeah, I think Callie will talk more about that at the end, but basically basically they will publish it on a website that will be freely available to the public. Callie's saying let's bring Frank on now. I think Frank Abe needs no introduction, but take it away, Frank.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Allison. I'm not a translator. On this project, I'm an editor. But the recovery of the literature of camp has been as much a part of my life these last 40 years as the recovery of the story of camp resistance, for which I've known. I'm going to quickly survey the Issei voices that Floyd Chung and I will be recovering in a project commissioned by his editor at Penguin Classics. And Kimiko, you can share the screen now. Floyd and I had a great collaboration with Greg Robinson on this recent anthology of the life and work of John Okada. So when Floyd got the assignment for a new anthology of camp literature, his question to me was, did I think there's much of anything new to cover since the publication 20 years ago, Patricia Wakida's excellent collection with Lawson Inada called All We Could Carry? And I said, yeah. Since that time, a lot of work's been done to recover the voices of the Issei, who were writing and publishing in Japanese in camp, what the late Yuji Ichioka called our buried past. So a little like the graphic novel, I'm going to switch this here. A little like the graphic novel that I just did on Camp Resistance, our anthology will be organized around a chronological timeline of the series of government actions and orders that drove the experience of incarceration, so that readers can experience the camps in the same sequence as the incarcerees. And our anthology has 4 parts. Has the Gestapo come to America? Iron Gate. It's the country that's not loyal to us. Never again is now. A little bit like categories in Jeopardy when I read it out loud. We set the stage for this collection with the adventure of the Issei in emigrating to America, as captured in this self-published comic strip by Henry Kiyama in 1931. The manga Yonin Shonsei, or the Forged Students comic, was the first known Japanese-American graphic narrative. And here's the cover. Here's the cover, translated by manga expert Frederick Schott in 1999, Stonebridge Press, Berkeley. Kiyama shows the arrival of the 4 students through Angel Island in San Francisco, and you get a vivid sense of the freedom and opportunity that draws all immigrants to America. Much of it is satiric irony, but Kiyama also confronts the racism of the Turlock incident of July 1921, where 60 Issei fruit pickers were run out of town by a mob of white workers angry at having their wages undercut by the Japanese. And he shows how the Issei, desperate for a path to naturalize U.S. citizenship, which was denied them, how they enlisted in the U.S. Army to fight in World War I, only to still be denied citizenship based on their race. In World War II, of course, the Issei leaders were arrested right after Pearl Harbor, starting with the Buddhist priests, and we don't often hear their story in their own words. Bunryu Fujimura of the Salinas Buddhist Temple wrote this little-known memoir, Though I Be Crushed, translated by Kenichi Yokogawa. We found it thanks to a brief mention in Duncan Williams' American Sutra, by the way. Fujimura describes the worst fears of those arrested by the FBI and held in the gym of the immigration office in San Francisco. The authorities seem to have already decided that I am a spy, I thought, and regardless of how I proclaim my innocence, it is highly unlikely that I would even care to listen. And since we're at war, I will undoubtedly be executed. So we've discussed the Heart Mountain Bungei magazine. At Tule Lake, the literary magazine was called Tessaku, or Iron Gate, which I find kind of ominous. I was introduced to the Tessaku by the doctoral dissertation of Junko Kobayashi, who wrote for the University of Iowa. And in Bittersweet Home, Kobayashi describes Tessaku and highlights two stories in particular. One is, and Andrew, forgive me on this, Chichi mo Hipparareta, My Father Was Also Taken Away, by Fujio Tanizaki, which shares the story of family separations. Rather than children being taken from their families, as we saw recently on the southern border, for the Issei, family separation meant families being ripped from their wives and children. We commissioned a translation by Andrew Leong at UC Berkeley, and it reveals that Tanizaki writes from the point of view of a middle school son named Kenji, to describe how, during a tearful farewell, an Issei woman gets around a guard's order not to use Japanese. "Speak English!" A guard standing off to the side yelled out. "All right," his father said. It was in that moment when his father was turning to look up at the guard that Kenji realized how pale his father's face was, how dark and sunken his eyes were. Kenji's mother looked down at the scraps of paper she had prepared, and while continuing to speak in Japanese, threw in loud ands, and buts to make it sound like she was speaking in English. Through this difficult method, she was able to get across all that needed to be said. From the 7th volume of Tessaku, published in February of 1945, Junko also pointed us to a remarkably accomplished short story by Joji Nozawa, Shiganhei no Chichi, or Father of the Volunteers, which Andrew Leong also translated for us. Now, in this story, an Issei mess hall chief permits his two oldest sons to volunteer for the army out of camp, believing that, as Nisei citizens, they had to perform their duties as well as claim their rights as citizens. But when the pressure he and his wife get from the resegregationists at Tule Lake becomes too much, he applies for relocation out of camp and a job as a live-in cook for a white family. Then their third precious son volunteers, and in quick succession in the story, all three sons are lost in combat, and a newspaper man interviews the father of the volunteers. The next morning, the man is doing his job brewing coffee when his employer enters the kitchen with a smile on his face and hands Mr. Saeki the newspaper. Printed in the paper was an article about his three sons' deaths, accompanied by a 4x6 portrait of Mr. Saeki. The article included his remarks, within which were these printed words with the following quote: "When I think about how my three sons have died for America, I think of how content they are now in heaven. When I think this, I do not feel sadness, but rather a far greater feeling of honorable happiness." These were the words that Mr. Saeki had said to the journalist the day before, but reading them now, he felt like he wanted to vomit. These people's faces became the faces of everyone in camp, even his closest friends, his family. Everyone was laughing at him. Mr. Saeki, his blood boiling, wanted to defy them, to shout at them, to call them damned fools. But those words just turned back upon him, expressions of his own self-loathing. Why didn't he just bash his head in against the wall? He wanted to beat himself senseless. He looked at the picture of himself in the newspaper and saw a perfect specimen of a village idiot. Like tongues of flame, a violent anger flickered, caught, and burst within him. Mr. Saeki did not care that his employer was standing next to him. He crushed the paper into a crumpled ball, slammed it down into the wastepaper basket in the corner, and then stomped on the basket, smashing it with all his might. Just reading that aloud, it sounds very much like the self-loathing of Ichiro Yamada in John Okada's Nono Boy, right? So there are more translations to share. Frank Chin and I found this scrap of paper in the wallet of a Heart Mountain draft resistor, who had carried it around with him for 50 years in his wallet. It's a jailhouse lyric called Song of Cheyenne, composed by Eddie Yanagisako and Kenroku Sumida of Hawaii, while they were awaiting trial with 61 others in the Cheyenne County Jail for draft evasion. So we gave it, just like this, to the actor Mako, and he immediately recognized it, the meter, as corresponding to the Hawaiian plantation work song known as the Hore Hore Bushi. So instead of reading the poem for us at a public event, Mako sang it for us. And Himiko, you can hit it.
Aloha Cheyenne, kago no naka, toto naname sunde iru, hige wa bobo to haemashita, dare ga ichiban nagai kato.
Goes on for several verses like that. Mako told us the Hore Hore Bushi, on which it's based, has 100 verses. The point here is that, we studied the haiku and the prose, but the Issei also sang. They like to drink and sing. And just hearing Mako bring that alive, it reminds us that these are not just words on the page, but living experience of the Issei. These lyrics, by the way, were translated to English for us by the late Violet Kazue de Cristoforo of Salinas. And we need another hour to fully explore Violet's story at Tule Lake Segregation Center, of her experience. But since Mai Ling Hong is watching, let me quickly mention that Violet was outraged after her brother Tokyo Yamane was falsely accused and brutally beaten in the big Tule Lake disturbance of November 1943. There's obviously no photos of that, so this is how we drew it for our graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse. Yamane was thrown into the notorious Tule Lake Stockade, and Violet led the Legal Defense Committee to try to get him and hundreds of others out. Now, when the snow melted in the spring, it exposed the sprouting native tule reeds. And Lisa, mentioned about seasonal words and native imagery and haiku, references to plants and so on. Well, here, I'm going to show you one of Violet's haiku and what went into it. This is Gate 3 at Tule Lake, the Stockade Gate. When the men went on a hunger strike, Violet and the other women tried to crash the Stockade Gate to get the men transferred to the camp hospital. So the beating was in November of 43. Snow melts in the spring. This is August of 44. And the Tule, the flowers have sprouted by now, of course. And all that is the background that Violet packs into the top line there. You can read it for yourself in Japanese. And Lisa, it's also in one line as well. It's not broken up. Which Violet translated the top line as this: flowers on tule reeds and sandy flats, brother confined over 200 days. So Poetic Reflections is the title that Violet gave to her collection of translations of haiku by herself and others at Tule Lake. And I'll just leave you with this thought, that the title of her collection may sound poetic and reflective, but her experience of Tule Lake was one of anger and violence. I'll stop there. Thank you. Back to you, Callie.
Okay. Yeah. So, wow. There is a lot going on in all of this literature. Frank, as you're talking about the theme of separation, actually, Lisa and Allison, I don't know if you were thinking about this, but one of the things I recalled is that separation is a repeated theme throughout the Bungei as well.
Well, it has to be, yeah. I mean, sons going off to war, segregation of the yes, yes, no, no, going to Tule Lake, all those things, yes. And families resettling to the east as well, yeah.
I'm so sad that actually Kenji couldn't join us, because one of the poems that he translated was a long-form poem about a friend being sent to the segregation camp, likely Tule Lake. And I'm sure he would have things to say on this. So one of the questions I wanted to toss out really quick. So for Lisa and Allison, what did you consider the biggest challenge of the Bungei in particular, since both of you are very experienced translators? beyond the collaboration with so many people, which was an adventure in and of itself.
Do you want to go first, Allison?
Sure. I mean, it's kind of hard to separate out. I mean, there were so many different things that were challenging about it. The language, the subject matter, the themes, and like something that Lisa alluded to or that she touched upon was sort of the weight of what we were translating. This is not, I think very highly of novels and literature. I think they're important, and I want them to, be around, and I think they have a very noble purpose. But this was, I just felt like I said, it was this once in a lifetime opportunity to really do something. It was so historic, and so I guess it was that the responsibility may have been be able to work with everybody together.
Yeah, I think I would say something similar, apart from the linguistic elements of it, which were, it was challenging at times, definitely, because I'm not a tanka or haiku scholar. I felt at times this called for that level of expertise. And I'm not a scholar of sort of, pre-modern literary forms. So at times I felt I was just kind of groping in the dark, but definitely the sense of responsibility. I am, I guess I identify as Japanese American, but my family was not incarcerated. And so I was also aware that this was a history I was connected to, but I was also not my own. And so I felt, definitely a sense that these were real people's families that, I didn't want to misrepresent something. I didn't want to I felt that making a mistake in a context like this carried more weight than maybe a different kind of more commercial project. So yeah, I think I would say that was it for me as well.
When I was initially assigned this project, I had done some work with the Bungei as part of my own graduate student research, and I knew I didn't have the background to actually, things like just the fine points of what zuhitsu even are. Allison, I really appreciated the explanation you gave, because it was like, okay, now I understand what this is what's happening here. But then also, Lisa, as you said, the amount of interreferentiality in haiku. So another question for Frank, and this is kind of an internal, like my perspective of having been working on this. One of the things that has been a major conversation at Heart Mountain, especially with how we were going to present this online, was the fact that this is a curated volume, and that there were deliberate decisions being made about, what order things are being presented in, which pieces are being selected. So as an editor who is working on a volume of collected literature, kind of what is your perspective on that curation? How are you making decisions on what specific pieces you want to include?
To make it easy for ourselves, rather than trying to do kind of a greatest hits of fine writing, the problem I've always had with those is that you never really understand the background of them. So by establishing a chronological timeline before the war, during the war, after the war, very crudely, but also breaking it down more granularly to the events in camp that the people had to react to, the opening of the draft to the young boys, the loyalty questionnaire, the draft being instituted in camp, and also the Denaturalization Act, 1944, which for the first time allowed the Kibe Issei to renounce their citizenship, American citizenship, at Tule Lake mostly. So what we wanted to do was to align the pieces to the historical events, so you could see the Japanese America as a having a shared experience, not just a unique personal sense of nature, for example, but I mean a collective experience of having to deal with the government. All this incarceration literature exists because of the incarceration, because of the eviction and expulsion. So that is the kind of the organizing principle for at least our anthology, was to organize it to show what they're responding to, provide the background, as I did for, Violet Cristoforo's, 2 lines of haiku of her brother being in stockade for 200 days. She boiled that down from a year of, like I said, anger and pain.
Yeah. So for Lisa and Allison, one of the things that you were talking about, the time setting of many of these. And one of the interesting things about the Bungei has been that sense of time passing. The volumes that we've translated so far haven't gotten into it yet, but as this Bungei was being translated was as the draft was initiated in these camps. And in fact, the very next volume that's going to be translated is pretty much, we're going to start encountering things that were written as the Heart Mountain draft resistance movement was really taking hold and moving. And I'm thinking about that song that he carried in his wallet all those years. And it makes me wonder what is going to be hidden away in there.
Yeah, Callie, I got to talk to you offline, Callie, about a table of contents for that last issue, and talking to you about maybe getting some pieces translated early so we can include them, because I'm really eager to see, what Paul Tsuneishi's father may have written about, his mess hall meetings where he argued in favor of the Fair Play Committee.
Yeah. I want to see that too.
Yeah, okay.
Grant application is in. We shall see if we hear back. In terms of just audience questions now, from James Okamura, there was the question about which camp blocks the Bungei and Tessaku were published in. I don't know about the Tessaku, but one of the interesting things that came out of the translation project, we also translated just the editorial material. So at the end, you have editor's notes with thank yous and reports on this is how much we made on the first volume. And one of the things that they say is, hey, send your manuscripts to Iwamuro Yoshiaki at his home barrack address. Which, oh my goodness, Block 14 had so much stuff going on in it. Sorry, it's just, there are a number of famous names in that block. It's like, did they have a magnetic attraction going or something?
Do you know where they published the Bungei? I mean, where in the camp, which block did they publish it?
They used the same printing materials as the Sentinel. The camp newspaper.
Okay.
I suspect they generally used the high school as well if there were additional things that needed to be done, because the high school had the necessary equipment. I don't know about the Tessaku on that one, but
no, we got to do more research on that still. How about Clyde Fugami's question about contact between the various clubs? Camps. Did you see any evidence of correspondence between the different clubs in your readings?
So within the 2 that we have translated so far, there was not as much, although I think, Allison, you were the one who translated the Zwichte about the worker in Colorado. In the second book. So you do have people traveling, sending messages back. There were also people who had left the camp sending haiku in and the haiku were listed from St. Paul.
Yeah.
That being said,
we know that people read newspapers,
Yeah.
the camps. So those exchanges of newspapers, and so the question of
in the later
exchanges of literary
volumes,
magazines is a good question.
yeah, in the later volumes, there were definitely sections published that were written by people from other camps, from Amachi and from Minadoka. So there definitely, especially as time went on, conversations were going on between the camps. And I have seen that at other places. I know that the camp in Colorado, Amachi and or Granada, they had a very small publication, and it did include things from other camps, including Heart Mountain. So there was a lot of conversation going on. As for just Okumura's question about making things available, the website was supposed to be up in time for this particular panel, but we encountered delays because that is the word of everyone's life in the past 2 years. But we intend for it to be up within a month. And that will be the translations, pretty much what I showed in the mock-up. We're also going to make the PDFs of the complete sections available for educational purposes, because this is very much a, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not doing this for profit. This is meant for people to be able to access this piece of history. As for the original documents, Heart Mountain keeps those in the archives. One of the, in fact, biggest challenges that we ran into with the transcription phase of this project was that the documents are very fragile. They were made on low quality paper that has not stood the test of time very well, and just getting images available to be used was in and of itself a challenge, and I wish we had been able to do a better job of it. That being said, there are going to be some available, I think. And the other thing is, as I said, the original pages of the documents are going to be included on the website because, in fact, I mean, there is art on those pages that is really striking to look at. Initially, it was Estelle Ishigo. Later volumes had Paul Motoyoshi. And some of that art is, there is one, it was on a free verse poem. I believe it was the Meadows of Light one. And Estelle's art on that page is so striking because what she draws is a physically impossible landscape, because it is a perspective looking down at Heart Mountain, at the camp, with Heart Mountain in the background. I always have to catch myself when I'm talking about the mountain and the camp because they have the same name. With this sagebrush kind of overlooking it, and that's a physically impossible view. You cannot get that here. But it's a very clearly a callback to classical ink paintings, the landscapes with the tall mountains and a tree overhanging from a cliff looking out. And it just reminded me so much of this conversation, both the zuihitsu format and the haiku and the kigo especially. How do you handle the kigo in a Wyoming environment? So we're definitely doing everything we can to keep those images in there because that is part of what the Bungei was.
There were 7 issues of Tessaku that I know of. How many issues of the Heart Mountain Bungei were there?
6 that I know of. And we have 5. So
is the missing one going to be in that UCLA collection I pointed you to? That the 1997.
I think it may be. So part of our best information about the Heart Mountain Bungei was an essay written by a pair of Japanese scholars who were interested in the history of Japanese American literature. And it looks like some of them like they had access to some of these volumes and possibly the one that we're missing. The other option I have is that Satoru Tsuneishi's work is collected in the archives of UCLA. And I was looking through it, and it mentioned having copies of the Bungei, and it listed the months. And I think one of those months, I think it was the September one, was one that we didn't have.
Right.
So it's like, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, in 1997, these two scholars in Japan published an entire series of like 12 volumes of the Nikkei America Bungaku Zashi Shusei. Thanks, Andrew. That is still at UCLA and I think one other institution. So you got to go get that.
Yep. In addition, the analysis sections that they published are all available on discovernikkei.org.
Right.
I checked. So if you can read Japanese, you can get access to their summaries of each of the camps, their analysis of the literature. And so, yeah, they covered, I think, 4 different magazines. I know Tessaku was one of them, and Heart Mountain Bungei was one. There were a couple others. And
Gila River too, I think, yeah. But there are several others, as many as they had.
Oh, so we have a question here. I don't actually know the answer to this one, but Lisa and Allison, maybe you've heard this. One of the question is tanka often sung?
Not to my knowledge, in the modern period, at least. Yeah, could be wrong about that, but I haven't heard that. What about you, Allison?
I'm prose. I work with prose. I don't.
Well, Kathy Masaoka's heard it sung, but I mean, there are a lot of just song lyrics that we have.
Yeah, and that could very well have been the case
like
in
that,
J communities. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kathy, to answer your question, the whole Mako singing thing is on a second disc of the DVD of Conscience of the Constitution, so you can find it there.
So I think, Lisa and Allison, I think you covered this to a certain extent, but this is Okumura. How did you resolve difficulties you encountered with period-specific Japanese language? So that would be terms that were very specific to the Meiji or Tocho eras.
A lot of research and consulting other people, consulting each other.
And we, as the team itself, we had to there was terminology that we as a team kind of decided how it would be referenced, whether or not we would call it the center or the incarceration center, or which terms we would use. Those were all very loaded. So
yeah, and I remember we had the whole conversation that we had about what do we do when we encounter language that was stuff that today would be considered politically unacceptable. Because, I mean, there were issues with racism within the Japanese American community, not just what they experienced, but their own attitude sometimes towards other peoples. So that was an interesting challenge to meet. So I think we have actually run about 10 minutes over time. It looks like we probably don't have more questions. Frank?
Just someone asked about when will our book be available. The Penguin book should be available. Well, we got to finish it first, but hopefully 2023 would be our goal for the publication.
And fingers crossed, we'll be able to get a few more of the Bungei's materials into that as well.
Yes, please. And
I know you're really excited for that.
How soon is the Bungei going to go online, Callie? What's your estimate now?
Very soon.
Very soon.
I mean, at this point, the underlying structure is close to done, and that is the serious time-consuming part. After that, it's going to be a matter of getting things uploaded, which could take a little while. I expect I'm going to be embedded in those transcriptions, trying to make final decisions on what's actually going to be on the website for that particular version for a while. But
Well, looking forward to it. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.
yes, thank you all, Lisa and Allison especially. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and do this with us. And also thank you for all of the hard work that you did. It's really appreciated. Frank?
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
for having us on the panel. Yeah.
Nice to meet you guys.
Shout out to the rest of the translators, especially Joe Boxman.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Shout out to everybody who worked on this. All right.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.